My name is Daniel Pryor, and I'm head of programs at the Adam Smith Institute, which is one of Britain's leading free market think tanks. And part of my job is to conduct original policy research with a special focus on drug policy. And I'm also responsible for organising various events and education programs for young people. And for a long time now, I've been an advocate of reforming the UK's current approach to illicit drugs. I grew up near Southend in Essex and saw the failures of our current drug policy firsthand. The dealers were often teenagers themselves, people I went to school with, for example, and they never asked for ID, nor did they need it. Most didn't know the potency of the products that they were selling, and they offered no information at all on the potential health effects on the people that were using them. And I think worst of all, none of them could easily access treatment if their drug use got out of hand. You had some being robbed at knife point because it is currently a criminal market, and others risked even worse when they climbed into strangers' cars to buy cannabis, for example. So I've been an advocate of changing our approach to drug policy for quite some time now. In terms of the recent work that I've done, in 2019, I co-authored The Green Light, which is the Adam Smith Institute's blueprint for a legal, regulated recreational cannabis market in the UK, and I also regularly provide media comment on drug policy issues for newspapers, radio, and TV. And in terms of my main interests, so the first one I just mentioned there is probably looking at the current state of our cannabis market and the ways that we can reform that in order to better protect people's health and well-being. And in my opinion, the UK's current approach to cannabis is only really generating misery. It's fueling gang violence and increasing crime. We're in a situation where some high quality research from another think tank, Voltfast, has found that it's easier for children to get cannabis than it is to get alcohol. And it's most often the more potentially dangerous varieties of skunk with high levels of THC, the psychoactive component in cannabis, that dominates the illegal market. 1/3 of Brits have used cannabis at some point in their life. And if that doesn't undermine the rule of law, the fact that our drug law enforcement depends on where you live and to a certain extent your ethnicity, I don't know what does. On the flip side, I think that the evidence for legalization that we have from various US states as well as other countries such as Canada is pretty overwhelming. We've got some high quality peer-reviewed research that shows impacts on young people's use, shows that it would protect children, shows that it would reduce, or in some cases drastically reduce, the size of the criminal and violent criminal market. There's also evidence that we can encourage safer forms of cannabis consumption and help to educate people about the effects of cannabis if we get our regulatory system right. On the other hand, there's various other issues related to drug policy that I'm specifically interested in. One of them is looking at harm reduction and how we can stem the amount of drug deaths that are currently taking place in the UK, with a special focus on Scotland, which has the highest drug death rate in the EU. If you look, for example, at Glasgow City, their drug death rate is over 1,000% higher than the European average. And to me, that suggests that our current approach, again, isn't working as well as it should be. We might have politicians in Westminster and Holyrood acknowledging that there's a problem, but as far as I can see, they have yet to take decisive action. One of the things that we could do now, and that has been a real cause for campaigners from all sorts of different political backgrounds and non-political backgrounds, is safe consumption rooms. And the idea behind these is very simple. It's trying to make illicit drug use, such as heroin, for example, injecting heroin, less deadly in the short term, and also help introduce people to recovery services in the long term. And these safe consumption rooms try to provide people with things like sterilized injecting equipment, medical care from trained staff, and referral services to various allied council services. And of particular importance of these facilities is the on-site provision of naloxone, which is a medication that can really help to reverse the life-threatening effects of a heroin overdose. And these safe consumption rooms are something that are in place around the world. If you look at France, Germany, Spain, many more of our European neighbors, and further abroad, many developed countries already have safe consumption rooms serving the areas of highest need, areas like Glasgow City that could do with effective, proven harm reduction measures. And the international evidence for these safe consumption rooms is very clear as well. I was part of the Adam Smith Institute's report released on the subject called Room for Improvement, which highlighted a large body of research showing that these facilities help to curb drug-related deaths. They also improve public health and decrease things like syringe litter. And perhaps most importantly, they're also successful in engaging some more marginalized, hard-to-reach populations like homeless people in drug treatment. That might be why charities like HIV Scotland help support their introduction. The fact that Glasgow was subject to a recent spate of HIV infections is partially down to the fact that we don't really have these harm reduction facilities in place. Another kind of aspect of my work that I focus on a lot is looking at psilocybin and specifically looking at medicinal reforms to a drug known as psilocybin, which is currently very difficult for scientists to research. It's the molecule better known as the active ingredient in magic mushrooms. And for a long time now, we've had fairly minimal progress in depression research. It's been fairly stagnant for the last few decades, ever since the clinical approval of the first SSRIs. And now psilocybin, which is one of the most promising new areas of inquiry, research into that is being held back a little bit by some antiquated Home Office red tape, and it's making scientists in the UK very nervous, or it's making it very difficult for them to be able to study this. And this is despite the fact that we have quite strong evidence from contemporary early stage clinical trials that suggests that psilocybin therapy, when it's administered in a controlled environment, it may be a safe and effective treatment for things like PTSD, anxiety, and especially treatment-resistant depression. Now, as someone who has people close to me that have suffered quite significantly from mental ill health, and they haven't been able to kind of respond to the treatments that are already out here, this is another thing that I'm very passionate about changing, about making it easier for British scientists to be the best in the world and be best placed to research this new and promising mental health treatment. And psilocybin, it has the potential to really revolutionize mental health treatment. It doesn't work like traditional antidepressants. It works very differently. Patients don't seem to suffer from things like dependence or the severe side effects that are very well known amongst our existing depression treatments. And there are also significant cost savings for the NHS on the table. And the way that we change these regulations at the moment is that right now, psilocybin is under a set of regulations called Schedule 1, as opposed to the much more forgiving Schedule 2. The problem with these Schedule 1 regulations is that it makes it much more expensive and much more time consuming to conduct the sort of clinical trials that will help build the evidence base even more for psilocybin. Separate Schedule 1 licenses often cost thousands of pounds each for scientists, and they're required by the Home Office at every single stage in the drug supply chain. Researchers also have this mountain of really confusing and often illogical paperwork that accompanies each of these license applications. And even if you do manage to get through all that paperwork, obtaining one of these licenses, it can take months, or in some cases, it's been documented even years to actually get a hold of one of these things. And that's if you even pass the kind of ethics board, because there's so much stigma associated with Schedule 1 drugs, and this makes it more difficult to start things like academic collaborations, or even securing funding for research into what is a very promising alternative to traditional antidepressant medications. The often repeated justification for some of this heavy-handedness is that it's necessary to prevent psilocybin from being diverted towards street use. Now, that starts to look a little nonsensical when you consider that much more common street drugs, things like heroin and fentanyl, are all in Schedule 2 already. There's never been diversion from a research lab to street use, and that's something that's even less likely with psilocybin, since it's only going to be administered under clinical supervision in approved trials. So we at the Adam Smith Institute, alongside the Conservative Drug Policy Reform Group, as well as many top scientists working in this field, have been calling for psilocybin to be moved to Schedule 2 in one of our new papers. It's something that's very easy to do. All that's required is for the Home Secretary to implement a statutory instrument on the advice of the ACMD, and this would only loosen restrictions on research. This particular area of drug policy reform, I want to be very clear, it's something that wouldn't affect legal existing legal controls on psilocybin for non-medical or non-scientific use. So this is specifically medicinal-based reform, and it's also something that I'm very passionate about. So I guess that's the overview of some of the main things that that I focus on in my work at the ASI. Yeah, so I think that moving away from the kind of criminal justice-led approach to drug policy is an important first step, a vital first step, in fact, and that would presumably take the form of some type of decriminalization. And if you look at Portugal's decision to decriminalize all drugs in 2001, this really helped to pave the way for a more public health-centered approach that helped to reduce drug-related infectious diseases as well as drug-related deaths in Portugal. And that was all without any documented increase in the overall use of these formerly illicit drugs. And in the UK, you also have a situation where decriminalization would really help to curb some of the excesses of enforcement. If you look at the racial aspect of that, Black people are 9 times more likely to be stopped and searched for drugs, despite using them at a lower rate than white people. So decriminalization, I think, would really help with that aspect. It would also help with the criminal records that often affect people who are caught in possession, for example. And these criminal records can really ruin people's life chances, and they can actually make them more likely to get caught up in this kind of cycle of crime and of misery and violence. If you look at the impact of criminal records, most of the research, especially if you look at young people, suggests that, well, if you're less able to access accommodation, you're obviously less able to travel, your employment prospects are still significantly hurt. And all of this is a choice. It's a choice that policymakers have made. And it's really causing some very negative consequences without much success. The kind of counter argument, the idea that actually we should continue to criminalize drug users, is based on the idea that it's going to affect the levels of use. It's going to drive down use unless people use illicit drugs. And so the argument goes, there will therefore be less harm overall. The first point to make is that there's basically no evidence of any association between the level of how punitive your enforcement regime is and the overall levels of use of drugs. The Home Office itself has looked at this in studies over the past decade or so, and comparative studies for different countries, and found no clear relationship. There's a body of academic research as well that finds no clear relationship. The second thing is the idea that, well, even if you can't reduce demand, maybe you can reduce the supply of illicit drugs. I just look at the amount of drugs that are currently in our prisons as a kind of answer for that. If we can't keep drugs out of our prisons, how are we supposed to keep them out of our country? If you look at the kind of UK border, the estimated amounts of illicit drugs that they stop getting into the country is absolutely minuscule. It's basically very, very difficult to significantly dent the rate of use. The other point that I'd make is that even if you were able to slightly reduce the overall use rates of illicit drugs through, say, doubling down on criminalization, for example, that still doesn't translate into less harm. You still have people, a substantial body of people using various illicit drugs with absolutely no health information, absolutely no idea of where they come from, whether the drug that they're taking is in fact the drug that they thought they were taking. No information on dosage, which leads to far more overdose deaths. So the kind of overall level of use is not necessarily the best measure of how much harm has taken place. I'd much prefer a situation where we had a public health-led approach where people felt comfortable enough to engage with recovery services, and we used every single tool in our recovery toolkit, as it were, things like safe consumption rooms, things like testing services as well. It's a very important measure that we've only really started to do on a trial level at UK festivals and things. The Home Office has been much more open to that, and I'm very glad that they have been. But having some form of institutionalized testing, I think, would be even better in that it lets people find out, actually, they thought they were taking MDMA, they're actually taking PMA, and they might not take that drug anymore. They might adjust their dosage so they're less likely to die of an overdose. I think all of these things can really be helped and enabled by moving away from a criminal justice-led approach. For someone who perhaps doesn't use any illicit drugs, what sort of changes could they expect in a country where we had more legal regulated markets? Well, the first thing is pretty obvious, and it's the tax take from the newly legal regulated market. On the economic sense, there's been various estimates ranging from your £100 million a year all the way up to billions of pounds a year, and that all depends on what the legal regulated market would look like. But we'd certainly see some increase in the taxation of these goods under a regulated market that we could then spend on various public health measures, or indeed anything else that might be an economic priority of the current government. So that's the first thing. The second thing I'd say is, if you take, for example, the a legal regulated cannabis market, the sort of people that you might have seen going around and dealing cannabis in a criminalized system, you'd now see kind of transformed in many ways, if we get our regulation right, into entrepreneurs, into legal entrepreneurs that are using their expertise and their skills to contribute to the economy and contribute to wider society, creating jobs for people, especially in deprived communities that may otherwise not have had those opportunities before. And that's something I think that doesn't just affect those people, it affects everyone in those communities as well. So that's a couple of things I think you'd see that are really, really valuable. In terms of the other kind of economic impacts, if you look at, for example, if you look at drug consumption rooms or safe consumption rooms, you'd see significant cost savings for the NHS, because these sort of harm reduction measures, things that make it easier for people to access clean needles, for example, and reducing the risk of various infections such as HIV. From an economic perspective, these kind of health issues will cost the NHS hundreds of millions of pounds every single year. And these are entirely preventable. So we'd be saving the NHS money as well by trying to move towards a more harm reduction and public health centered approach. One of the kind of key focus, I think, here is looking at how much things like depression costs the UK economy in a kind of social, economic and medical sense. So depression is the greatest contributing factor to suicide. It is a leading cause of disability, and it also costs the economy an estimated £10 billion annually. And if we were able, through psilocybin, to have a revolutionary treatment that really tackled things like treatment-resistant depression, where around 1.2 million British residents are estimated to be living with that, we'd see enormous economic benefits, not just from the kind of contribution that this would make to our life sciences industry, in terms of freeing it up to be able to be world leaders in depression research, but also in the actual effects on those people who are struggling with mental ill health today. That through this new treatment, many of them may be able to move on towards a kind of state of better mental health, and thereby not just have a better life and have higher well-being, but also be more economically productive as well. So this is something that rescheduling psilocybin would enormously help with. It's not just the fact that it's going to help people who have no access to treatments that will actually help them, finally giving them hope that they might have something that they're able to access. It's also that it's going to create a huge new boost to a really key UK industry that already employs a significant number of people, and would be able to grow exponentially if we were to really free up researchers to look into this promising new treatment. If we were to reschedule psilocybin, we have the opportunity to become world leaders in some cutting-edge mental health research. We can attract international talent and expertise. And this one simple and very sensible change could have really profound consequences on the mental health of millions of Brits in a very positive way.